It was by no means preordained, but perhaps it was inevitable. Born in 1943, the son of a Marine in World War II in a family of Marines, and spending his early childhood and formative years in France, put James L. Jones on the path to joining the United States Marine Corps, where he spent a distinguished 4-decade career, retiring as a decorated 4-star general. Hello, everyone. This is When It Mattered. I'm Chitra Ragavan. It's a real honor to speak with my guest today, General James Jones, who during his military career served as Commandant of the Marine Corps, Commander United States European Command, and Supreme Allied Commander Europe. After retiring from the Marine Corps in 2007, Jones served as chairman of the Congressional Independent Commission on the Security Forces of Iraq and later as special envoy for Middle East security. President Barack Obama then invited Jones to serve as his national security advisor. Jones now leads a global strategic advisory firm, Jones Group International, based here in the Washington, D.C. area. General Jones, welcome to When It Mattered.
Chitra, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Was there a pivotal moment or period in your life that kind of put you on the path to joining the military? I know I said it wasn't preordained, but it was perhaps inevitable. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. In retrospect, although I didn't come to that conclusion until later. But as I look back on my life and my formative years, young years in post-war France, 1946, my father's and his brother's contribution in World War II in the Pacific, and growing up overseas during the height of the Cold War, and being impressed by what the American military had achieved in both Europe and the Far East. I think all of those things really served at a very young age to form in my mind that service to one's nation is something that counts and is important. And I think that really molded me to eventually do what I wound up doing, even though I didn't know I was being pushed that way.
Yeah, and you moved to France with your parents when you were, I think, 2.5 years old, and you stayed there, I guess, through your high school years. What was that like to, I mean, a lot of us read about, World War II and World War II history, but you were in the middle of it. You were in Normandy, and just describe what that was like.
Well, so my father worked for an American company out of Chicago. It no longer exists, but it was a very large farm machinery company called International Harvester. And immediately after the war was over, International Harvester sent my father and mother and me over to France to help start a company over there, a branch of International Harvester. And they did that all over Europe, actually, in many, many countries, and also in North Africa. And so being an American family, transported from the Midwest of the United States into one of the European capitals, not speaking any French. My parents spoke no French whatsoever when they arrived there. For me, it was easy because young people pick up languages very quickly. So I was very quickly quite bilingual, and I went to French schools, I went to Nato schools, I went to the American School of Paris, and subsequently Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, because I honestly thought that I would eventually have a career in the Foreign Service and replicate what many families were doing all over the world. After coming back from Europe and rediscovering the United States, I joined the Marine Corps and was commissioned in 1967 and wound up staying for 40 years. But the post-war experience was something that really struck me as a young person. My parents used to talk about this place called the Iron Curtain, and in my mind there was a place somewhere where there was a big Iron Curtain, and behind the Iron Curtain was the enemy, the Russian soldier, so to speak, It was an interesting time because in those days, in the 50s, France was flirting with communism quite seriously. A lot of people were saying The American dream is in decline, the American political system's in decline, and communism would eventually take over. I lived through the space race between the Russians and the U.S. in the launching of Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit the Earth, and that had an impact on me. I guess you would say I was very competitive at a young age and very nationalistic, very patriotic, and very proud of being a young American, even though I hadn't lived in the U.S. except for long enough to be born there and to live there for a couple of years before being transported over to Europe. So all of those things came to my mind together and really directed me in the path that I eventually followed.
When we were speaking earlier, you said that you actually got into some scuffles with the kids in school over this, the sort of growing sense of communism and the kids sort of challenging American superiority.
Yeah, I learned a little bit about prejudice. I used to say that France has never forgiven us for the liberation, which is not quite fair. But in my early younger days in the primary or secondary schools, I was the only American in the school, and I was the only one with a different name, and I was the only one who wore different clothes, like American blue jeans and things like that, which you could not buy in post-war France, and frankly everybody wanted. So I gained an appreciation of what it was like to be different, to be considered different, even though I was perfectly bilingual and I spoke as good of French as any of my friends. But when they go home and talk to their parents about there's an American kid in our school, sometimes some of the post-war attitudes towards France, which is hard to understand, towards the United States, exhibited in France was somewhat anti-American. To be fair, we had a huge military presence. Nato was in France. The U.S. European Command was in France. We had air bases. We have, a very, very heavy presence all the way up until Charles de Gaulle asked us to leave in 1965. Not just the U.S., but everybody. And so, we had a couple of instances where our family car was painted with white paint that said "U.S. go home," and so there was a lot of anti-American feeling. But at the end of the day, you go back to France today, you can go up to Normandy, and you'll find a degree of warmth and welcome that shows that the people up along those very famous beaches have not forgotten what happened.
You stayed in France through high school, and you had a very scary experience before you returned home, a near-death experience. Could you describe that?
Well, I had a motorcycle accident in my junior year in high school, and it was something that was my fault entirely. I was going too fast, and I was taking a friend to a train station, and I collided with a light pickup truck, and my friend sailed over my head and landed with very little damage. I stayed on the motorcycle, crashed into a wall, and head first, and wound up in the hospital for several weeks. There are a lot of stories about people who've had near-death experiences, not much different, except that I remember a seemingly going down a lighted corridor towards a very powerful light, and then all of a sudden stopping and then going in reverse, so to speak. And then I woke up crumpled on the sidewalk, bleeding from my head, and had a pretty serious knee damage. And some of my friends who were driving home from school stopped and took me to the American hospital in Paris, where I spent a couple of weeks recovering.
Wow, that must have had quite an impact on you.
It did. It did. It taught me to put a helmet on.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So you come from a really long line of Marines. Could you tell us a little bit about that family lineage of Marines? It's pretty impressive.
Well, thank you. My father and his younger brother became Marines. My uncle was first, and I believe he joined in 1938. And my father actually had a Army commission, and as they told the story over the years, my uncle convinced my father to seek an inter-service transfer and become a Marine, and he did. And both of them served in the Pacific at the same time. And my father was a reconnaissance Marine. He landed on Japanese-held islands months before any invasion, where security was lax, but they would surface on a submarine, inflate rubber boats, paddle ashore, hide the boats, and conduct reconnaissance of possible landing beaches, enemy troop strength, and the like, and then paddle back out in the middle of the night and hope the submarine hadn't been sunk in the meantime. My uncle was a battalion commander in some of the famous battles on Guadalcanal, Okinawa, and the like. But he was the youngest battalion commander in the Marine Corps at the age of 27, mainly because most of the other more senior officers had been killed or wounded, and he was one of the ones that was left. My father left the Marine Corps in 1945, but never really left the Marine Corps. He was always very proud of being a Marine, and subsequently promoted all the way to colonel before he retired. My uncle was an active duty Marine for almost 40 years and retired as a lieutenant general in the early 1970s.
And you said something astonishing to me that there's been a Marine in your family on active duty every day since 1938?
Yeah, that's correct. So all the way through the family, five of us were on active duty during the Vietnam War, including my uncle, who was a general at the time. But I guess I was the next most senior guy. I was a second lieutenant, and then I had my two cousins that served as infantry officers in Vietnam, and my brother was a Marine, and one of my sons had 2 tours in Iraq as a Marine infantry officer. What's really, I think, unusual is that none of us ever went to a military school. Most of my family attended Kansas University, just as a matter of kind of tradition, I guess. And I was one of the exceptions, going to Georgetown. But none of us ever, all of us were volunteers and kind of what we would say walk-ons who volunteered to serve. And so my son is a lieutenant colonel in the reserves right now. And one of my cousins had a 20-year career as well. So we feel pretty well represented in Marine Corps history books.
That's for sure. But yeah, you thought you might end up in the diplomatic corps. You didn't think of the military as your first option, right?
That's correct. I mean, I went to the School of Foreign Service because it seemed like a logical fit. And frankly, I took advanced French so I could get an easy A.
You were at a competitive advantage there, I would say, by a degree.
And I took advantage of it too, I must say. No, I thought I really thought that's where I would wind up, that I would join the U.S. Foreign Service, and that's what I would do. But I was always going to join the Marine Corps, and I did that. Got a reserve commission for 3 years. Starting in 1967, would have been released from active duty in 1970, except that I decided I wasn't completely sure that I wanted to leave active duty because I really loved what I was doing. I loved the Marines. I loved the culture. I loved the discipline. I loved the competitiveness and the challenges that every day brought. My wife and I talked about it, and I said, well, let's just stick around a little bit longer and see what happens. And So the next benchmark was at the 20-year level, and I'd actually thought about retiring because for the first time I was going to have a staff job, which I'd never really wanted. But anyway, we decided to stay on beyond 20, and then we hit 30 and 40 and 40 years in 1 month, and I retired.
Yes, but by then you had served in many, many roles, right? You were, let's see, you were the commandant of the Marine Corps. You were the aide de camp to the commandant of the Marine Corps, right? That was at the 20-year mark.
Right.
And then you were commandant of the Marine Corps, and then promoted to general, and you served as commandant till 2003.
Right.
And then you became Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and you were, in fact, the first Marine to serve in that role. That must have been quite a mark of pride.
Yes, that was probably the easiest decision that I ever made, and it's the one that I did not expect. The Secretary of Defense called me into his office and said, we're looking for a replacement for General Ralston, who was the incumbent SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And so he asked me for my opinions. So I gave him a couple of names of people I thought would be good. Mine wasn't one of them. And he considered what I was saying, and he said, well, I think you should consider going. And I was really stunned. And I always thought that, that billet was reserved for mostly Army officers, and there had been 2 Air Force generals, but there'd never been an admiral or a Marine general in that billet. So I discussed it with my wife, and she could see the light in my eyes and the enthusiasm, and she said, okay, 4 more years or whatever.
She's like, he's never leaving.
She said, when is this going to end? But it was a great way to finish up a career. And maybe one of the ironic twists of life is that my father's last job was as the president of International Harvester in Belgium for the last 10 years of his European career. It was 27-year stint in Europe. So the last 10 were in Belgium. And his last office, before he retired, was about a 30-minute drive from my office at the NATO headquarters.
That is amazing. What a amazing journey back to where you started and to where he ended his career.
Full circle.
Yes, full circle. When you were Supreme Allied Commander Europe, by the way, I love that title so much. I told my kids, I asked them, can you call me Supreme Allied Commander Mom? I just really like the sound of that, but they didn't want to do that. But it's just to talk a little bit about what that role entailed. Among other things, you led Allied command operations, of NATO military forces in Europe, right? So what were some of the things you did as Supreme Allied Commander in terms of your key accomplishments with NATO in particular?
Well, I think the things that I recall the most was that when I got there in January of 2003, we had 19 countries in NATO. When I left there in January of 2007, we had 26. And going through the accession of 7 countries, mostly former Warsaw Pact countries, including the Baltic states. It was a phenomenal historical moment that, really for the first time convinced me that, really perhaps the Cold War is over. Perhaps, this the fall of the Soviet Union and the decline of the Soviet Union would usher in a period of peace in Europe that, as we like to say, peaceful Europe, whole and free. And in fact, we had in NATO, we had 2 councils that were very interesting in light of what's going on right now. One was the NATO-Russia Council, and the other one was the NATO-Ukraine Council.
Interesting.
and they regularly met. And the Russians were active participants in those meetings. NATO obviously was expanding into the former Warsaw Pact countries, which was something Vladimir Putin to this day holds against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And then I'd say the second thing that stands out in my mind most easily was shortly after I arrived at NATO, it was customary for the NATO ambassadors to host a welcome lunch for whoever the new Sakir was. And so the British ambassador held this welcoming lunch for me. And I studied up on everything I could about NATO and what it had done, and what we might be thinking about. NATO Response Force was something that everybody was excited about. And so I got to the lunch, and the British ambassador said, as the host, he said, I get to ask you the first question. And he said, my question is, General, how do you plan on getting the NATO's military into Afghanistan? And I thought it was a joke. I mean, I never dreamed that was even a remote possibility. But I could tell for the rest of the lunch that's all they wanted to talk about. And so it became task number one. And so from 2003 to 2004, we developed NATO's engagement strategy for making a contribution in Afghanistan. And in about this time in 2004 at the Munich Security Conference, I briefed the plan to all of the NATO defense ministers. They approved it. And so I would say that in addition to the expansion by 7 countries, but actually developing the plan for the first NATO out-of-area operation was probably the second thing that I remember the most.
And after you retired in 2007, President-elect Obama selected you as his national security advisor, and you had another opportunity to really think about the Soviet Union in a different way, to really get up close and personal in watching President Obama's interactions with Vladimir Putin. What did you learn from those interactions about Putin, and how does it inform what you see happening now today in the Ukraine?
What was most interesting about the first 2 years that I spent in the Obama administration was probably, in fact, the Russian relationship. In those days, Vladimir Putin was the prime minister, and President Medvedev was the president. So the primary interlocutor with the American president was President Medvedev, not the prime minister. And we took a trip over to Moscow, and in addition to meeting with the president, we had a breakfast meeting with the Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, in which he shared with us his belief that the worst thing that happened on the face of the planet in the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the blame for that goes to NATO. And he also shared with us that he believes that there was an agreement, which nobody can ever find any evidence that this was so, but he believes that there was an agreement that NATO would not expand into the former Warsaw Pact countries. And so the fact that we did, and the fact that one of the central questions I'm sure that's on his mind is Ukraine and NATO. What does the future hold there? Is really one of the big problems. And the last point he made was he also felt that the United States did not help Russia in its hour of need when they were in economic distress, which I don't think is true. I think the United States did an awful lot to help Russia during its time of need. But he holds that very much in his mind, and I believe it colors everything he's doing today.
So, given your knowledge of Putin and how he thinks and your leadership in NATO, what do you think is, I know we can't read the crystal ball here, but as of this taping, what do you think is likely to happen, and how will NATO emerge from all of this, weak or strong?
I think there's a possibility that the worst scenario that Vladimir Putin can imagine could emerge from this, and that is that NATO would be stronger. This evening, probably the largest delegation of American politicians, elected and appointed, is heading towards the Munich Security Conference. I think 40 members of Congress are attending. They're going to be disappointed, I think, because the Russians are not attending the conference for the first time in quite a while. But it goes to show you that after some years of neglect, I think of neglect to our leadership responsibilities in the alliance, in this moment of crisis, the United States has re-engaged and is re-engaging with our friends and allies, and showing some leadership that has been missing, quite frankly. And so I think it's possible that one of the scenarios that will come out of this is that NATO will be stronger, and it'll be stronger if the United States continues to exert the kind of leadership that our friends and allies expect.
Do you anticipate a diplomatic resolution?
I personally think that Mr. Putin should be looking for a graceful way out. I think it would be a catastrophic mistake for him and for his country to invade Ukraine. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I am always reminded by his lecture at breakfast in Moscow about the 3 or 4 things that he believes with regard to NATO and with regard to NATO's expansion into the former Warsaw Pact countries, is something that he has never accepted, and I don't think will ever accept. So it's unfortunate because during the President Medvedev's tour in office, we worked on and signed a START treaty. We agreed on Iran in many respects in terms of the nuclear program. We shared information about what we knew about the Iranian program, and they shared information back. We became, colleagues, and there was some enthusiasm about the fact that that just maybe Russia saw itself as a Euro-Atlantic country as opposed to a standalone hostile neighbor. But unfortunately, when President Putin returned to the presidency, he took Russia down a completely different path, which is regrettable.
I want to segue a little bit. We've talked quite a bit about how you and your family sort of epitomize patriotism, duty to your country, duty to the Constitution. What were your thoughts watching the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, and the military's seemingly slow response, and the fact that some current and numerous former members of the military were involved in the insurrection?
I think that's very regrettable. My father and my uncle repeatedly educated me on the unique role that the American military plays and the unique oath of office that we all take, prior to joining the military, and that is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Certainly, the president as commander-in-chief is the number one person in the chain of command. But the oath of office is to a document, and And I think we should take that very seriously. And I am not on the side that finds anything admirable about men or women in uniform who become politically oriented or motivated while wearing the uniform. And so I'm not terribly proud of those people who participated in the demonstration on January 6th. I think, we have millions of people who wear the uniform and wear it proudly and with great honor and great dignity, and they understand exactly what they're doing. So a significantly small percentage, unfortunately, gets the attention. But I think people should remember that by and large, the American military and the people who serve in uniform do so with great pride and great care and great respect for the Constitution.
Do you have any concerns at all about sort of the future of our democracy and the political independence of the military, given what happened, and if and the rise of right-wing militia groups and white nationalism, and if Donald Trump were to become president again and attempt something similar with the help of the large numbers of Republican politicians who've managed to convince themselves that the last election was stolen, do you fear at all, or are you assured that we're going to be okay?
Every decade of my adult life, the decline and demise of the United States has been predicted for one reason or the other. Whether it was post-war feelings of the inevitable rise of communism, whether it was during the Vietnam War, which was a war that seemingly without end or objective, or every decade, somebody, somewhere, people start beating on the drum saying the United States is in decline. My definition of decline, and when people should really start thinking hard about what's going on around us, is when a country can no longer bring itself to do the things that it must do and that its citizens know we must do, but find ourselves unable to do that, then that probably is an indication that that nation is in decline. One of the things that has colored my adult life is, frankly, the lessons of history, where every great civilization, every great power, every great moment in history where there's been a dominant force on the global playing field, every one of those has a beginning and they have an end, and the end comes one of two ways, either through external conquest or internal collapse. And most of the time, it's internal collapse. And its internal collapse comes as a result of that particular entity no longer being able to do the things that it needs to do, or to transform itself to meet the new requirements of the environment, political and otherwise. And so, change is something that great nations have to adapt to, and they have to recognize it. They have to recognize when they're heading down the wrong trail and make those changes. And right now, I think we're in a very awkward moment where just the evidence of the lack of civility, political discourse, the rise of social medias that attack people without any evidence, the whole personalization of the political process to where, one party disagrees with the other one simply because they said something. And this knee-jerk reaction to take the opposite view of what anybody says that you don't agree with. This is not healthy. I do believe we'll come out of it. I'm not sure when that will happen, but I know that if we're going to continue to be a great nation, the land of the free and the home of the brave, so to speak, and to continue to inspire other countries around the world whose citizens don't enjoy a tenth of the freedom that we take for granted, then I think, you know, we could be in a different situation. And I know that I'm personally convinced that, you know, countries like Russia and China and Iran are not going to change. They're not going to change their ways. They're not going to change their goals and aspirations. And they are bent on making sure that America is in decline, stays in decline, and that they, in some way, replace us as the next most important force on the face of the planet.
Looking back on your distinguished military career, General, is there one moment that you are proudest of, something that you reflect on?
There are quite a few moments, I think.
You had mentioned at your 20th year that you had this
Well,
metamorphosis about.
yes, I mean, there is, yeah. I mean, during my career, you know, one of the things that I was motivated by was the high standards of excellence that the Marine Corps demanded, and stimulated healthy competition among, you know, its members and so on and so forth. And so I was a pretty competitive guy, I thought, you know, in terms of, you know, the jobs I had and kind of how I saw my career developing. And I got to the 20-year mark as a lieutenant colonel, as a battalion commander out at Camp Pendleton in California, and I had this wonderful command, and there were many other battalions out there, but I really didn't have much connection with the others of my peer group who were different regiments, different organizations, and so I started really believing that, you know, there are some things that I was doing well. There were some things that we were doing that we weren't doing well, and I started going around talking to my peer group and saying, hey, I notice you guys are doing really well in your drug program. You know, can you, what do you attribute your success? And, you know, there was a little bit shocking to people that people were going around asking, okay, you know, what can I learn from you? And it was around that time I just decided, you know, I've been too focused on worrying about the next promotion or the next stage in the career, and I decided that I was no longer going to worry about the next promotion or the next job. I was just going to enjoy the moment, and let the chips fall where they may. And so for the next 20 years, I never really thought about the next job. They just happened. And I remember a general in my younger days who used to counsel us and say, you know, if you just concentrate on blooming where you're planted, you'll be fine. And you don't worry about anything else. Just do the best you can wherever you are, and the rest will take care of itself. And I learned that was probably pretty good advice.
Great advice, I would say. Yeah. This is a bit of an aside, but I think there's an interesting story here. I saw in an article that you were responsible for convincing country music artist Toby Keith to record, I guess it's his popular concert hit, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
So I was Commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, and I got a call from a reserve colonel who was then employed by the Joseph Coors Brewing Company. He said, and he called me up and he said, we have a young artist named Toby Keith and another duo named Brooks and Dunn under contract with Coors for a year. And how would you like to have a concert in Washington with these entertainers? And you can just, you know, we do it at Constitution Hall, and you can fill it with Marines, you know, free concert. And I said, well, nothing wrong with that. And so the plan materialized, and the day came, and actually I called the chief of naval operations, and we actually made it a mixed audience of sailors and Marines. And so I met Brooks and Dunn and Toby Keith at a little reception before the concert. And Toby Keith pulled me aside and said, I've got this song that I've been working on that I haven't released yet. And it's a little edgy, but it's a patriotic song, and I wrote it in honor of my dad. Do you think it would be okay if I tried it out? I said, Toby, you could go out there and sing Yankee Doodle Dandy, and they'd be very happy. You know, this is the friendliest audience you'll ever have. And so he did, and he sang courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. And it was received overwhelmingly with, this hysterical applause. And so he recorded it and released it, and it went to rocket ship up to #1 spot in the country music charts.
There you have it. There's another great accomplishment, right?
I mean, Toby Keith is an exceptional friend, and we became friends.
You've stayed in touch.
Yeah, we stayed in touch. We stay in touch today. I've got a couple of his guitars in my office, and we've toured together in Africa and different places where we've linked up. He's a great American. He's a great friend. I'm very proud to know him.
You play the guitar?
He gave me a couple of guitars, and I said, I'm going to learn how to play these things, but that's still work in progress.
You currently are very busy with your own global strategic advisory firm, Jones Group International, and probably one reason why you haven't really learned to play the guitar. What are your key areas of focus? What's on your mind these days in your inbox that kind of keeps you up at night?
Well, I think being 78 years old keeps me up at night. So I just hope I'm going to wake up in the morning. When I left government in 2010, I decided to try my hand at entrepreneurship. And so I started a company. And the intent of the company was to do good things, but do good things that made a difference, that could make a difference, that could enhance the value and the esteem in which our country is held. Straight consulting, and over the last decade, it's evolved into consulting, but also we actually do things. We're very involved in cybersecurity technologies. We are helping our friends and allies in several countries in the Middle East, and also in Europe and NATO in particular, NATO countries. And it's really stimulating, fascinating work. And hopefully we're doing some good, being an American company, but trying to contribute to the freedom and the friendships and the alliances that we have around the world, and to show that the United States is a reliable partner through the private sector. And we do consult with our government. My policy is I don't do anything that's not consistent with our foreign policy. And so if it's helpful and we can do something to be helpful, we'll try our best to do it and do it very well.
General Jones, in closing, looking back at your younger self, that child growing up in France, visiting Normandy, that cemetery at Omaha Beach, the boy who scuffled with his fellow French students over communism, the combat veteran who stayed 40 years in the military, never intending to, and carrying your Marine lineage forward all the way over to your son, and that national security advisor who watched Vladimir Putin in action. What would you say, looking back on this incredible career you've had, and to your younger self about the journey that you've been on?
Well, I'd say that, and I do think about this, I'd say I've been very fortunate. I was very fortunate to be raised by a wonderful set of parents and a wider family that was able to participate in one of the most dramatic moments in history, World War II, and all of the events thereafter. And to have been able to participate in many of those events has been something that, I feel deeply respectful for the opportunity, and all I can do is hope that somewhere along the line that we were able to do some good for people around the world, in various parts of the world. And in the days I have left, I am very interested in making sure, or trying to help in any way possible, that the roles and purposes of the American way of life is made available to as many people as possible. I mean, freedom is actually something you have to work for. The United States has been blessed to have been given that mantle of responsibility, certainly in the 20th century and in the first part of the 21st century. And I hope that as we go through these difficult times, that we see people who will emerge and step forward and volunteer to serve in elected office and in military office and in service to the country, that can get us back on the right track to where I think our rightful place is in the 21st century.
Yeah, my 16-year-old is a World War II buff. He thinks of nothing else but World War II, and his current assignment he's working on is extensive research into the Schlieffen Plan. And so he's been telling me all about the Schlieffen Plan. But he says, every walk we take is a World War II walk. I think he'll be teaching history and he'll be teaching World War II.
I think if somebody said, if you could relive your life in a certain period of time, what would you choose to do? And I think if I'd been born 20 years earlier, I think that's the period I would have liked to have lived my life in, even though it was very tough. I mean, it was, it would not have been World War I, but just the images of World War II and just how that happened on a global scale is just amazing.
So you would have liked to live through that?
I think as I look at all the pictures today and the books that I read and everything else, I thought, life was pretty simple then. There was either good guys here and bad guys there, and there weren't too many subtleties, right?
Yeah, that's right. General Jones, thank you so much for being my guest on When It Mattered and for this inspiring and absolutely amazing conversation.
Chitra, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I've always enjoyed our conversations, and this one is no different. Thank you.
James Jones is a retired 4-star general who, during his distinguished 4-decade military career, served as Commandant of the Marine Corps, Commander, United States European Command, and Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. After retiring from the Marine Corps in 2007, Jones served as chairman of the Congressional Independent Commission on the Security Forces of Iraq, later as special envoy for Middle East security and President Barack Obama's national security advisor. Jones now leads his own global strategic advisory firm, Jones Group International, based here in the Washington, D.C. area. This is When It Mattered. I'm Chitra Ragavan. When It Mattered is a podcast from Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups with brand strategy, positioning, and narrative. Our producer is Jeremy Kaur, founder and CEO of Executive Podcasting Solutions, with production assistance from Kate Cruz. Our creative advisor is Adi Wineland, and our research and logistics lead is Sarah Muller. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. And if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars, leave a review, and do recommend it to your friends, family, and colleagues. For questions, comments, and transcripts, please visit our website at goodstory.io or send us an email at podcast@goodstory.io. Join us next week for another episode of When It Mattered. I'll see you then.